So I'm in the process of watching White Lotus, and I finally got to that part with the monologue, and I just wanted to share some of my thoughts with you about the monologue. So in the show, Rick meets up with a friend of his who is a con artist as well, and he shares that while he came to Thailand forever ago, he was kind of like a kid in a candy shop when it came to his relationships with Asian women. He came here because he really liked Asian girls and he wanted to be with as many as possible. And he ended up going on a bit of a binge where he was having sex with as many as possible. And then it stopped fulfilling him. And he started to recognize that he didn't necessarily want to fuck Asian women. He wanted to be one of those Asian women being fucked by a white man. And so he started to cross-dress. He would meet up with people. He would meet up with men. And then he would hire a sex worker who would watch him while he's with these men and would be degraded, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He would get really excited by this. It would really turn him on to get dressed up and to sort of like be in this sort of, in his view, representation of what a ladyboy would be. He even went as far as to say that he looked better than some of them. Now, I have a lot of thoughts about this as a trans woman who has had a lot of experience interacting with cross-dressers. And when I first saw this being discussed on here, it was discussed in the context of autogynephelia, which is a lot of people's favorite little phrase. Autogynephelia is something that's often cited, frankly, within the context of transphobic conversations. Autogynephelia is essentially men who enjoy cross-dressing because they enjoy the image of themselves as women sexually, right? Typically, this comes up in the context of trans women, especially trans women who are attracted to women, because the accusation is that if you are a transgender woman, you have some form of autogynephelia. Now, I have never loved autogynephelia as a concept, mostly just because, in my opinion, the way that it's often cited, just, in my opinion, is usually there to be more of a shaming tactic than anything. Like, people only talk about autogynephelia usually in the context of like, here's this trans woman on a dating app who is looking for women. And because this trans woman doesn't pass or hasn't had enough surgery or, doesn't look a certain way, they're an autogynephile because their presentation isn't, from their perspective, genuine. And I think that assumes quite a bit about a person, so I don't love it. But I definitely think that cross-dressers have some form of autogynephilia, because from my observation, a lot of cross-dressers really do create this alternative persona where they create a lot of these different sexual tableaus, usually in the form of pictures and such, that they trade often with other cross-dressers to excite themselves. And I think to really understand that, you kind of have to understand a lot of the dudes who cross-dress and where they're coming from. So I am somebody who, unfortunately, doesn't really date men who are not, I would say, classically masculine. So the vast majority of the time that I have interacted with a cross-dresser, it's because I met them as a hyper-masculine man. And usually I either find this out later down the line or I catch them. And a lot of cross-dressers will approach transgender women with the thought that because transgender women are transgender, they're going to be more accepting of them as cross-dressers. So I've had a lot of arguments and debates with cross-dressers, but for a lot of cross-dressers, the appeal of cross-dressing, and I want to be very clear that there is no one type of cross-dresser. There's common, types of cross-dressers, but just because of, I just don't want to offend everyone. I'm going to be talking about heterosexual cross-dressers in this video because those do exist. And heterosexual cross-dressers, I would say, are probably the most common type of cross-dresser. These are men who live their lives in a very particular way where they're very invested in gender roles. And they're usually very invested in maintaining heterosexism to some degree. So these are people who in their daily lives are very masculine men who you would look at and say, oh, that is a man, right? Like I used to live in Orange County and I would run into a handful of these guys, especially out there. And a lot of these dudes, these are the dudes who you would see at, a Trump rally. These are your kind of like beer drinking Duty McDudersons who, are very masculine in a very particular way. And quite often in their heterosexual expression, they are a little bit abusive towards women. And they're abusive towards women, usually citing this sort of binary that is connected to heterosexism. So they have a very solid and almost immovable idea of what a man should be doing and what a woman should be doing. So they'll often mistreat women under the argument that women don't deserve a lot of respect, right? And they'll do what they do, often with the excuse that they're men and that's just what men do, that sort of thing. These are people who I can say from my own experience are a little bit more invested in gender roles than most people are. So what happens is they end up developing a lot of taboo feelings around the idea of being feminine. These are the kind of guys who will steal their girlfriend's underwear, but they might like wear it to work, right? They'll go to their job dressed in their like masculine clothing, but they'll have panties on, always with this kind of like taboo internal thought of like, ooh, no one knows that I'm wearing panties. And sometimes the further they start getting into exploring, feminine dress, they will start to develop, a way of putting themselves together. And a lot of these men, they do have this belief that they understand femininity and what a woman should be doing and how a woman should be presenting herself in a way that your average cis woman doesn't. This may be because of my age, but a lot of the cross-dressers that I've interacted with were men who fetishized a very specific, glamorous kind of idea of a woman from the 80s. So when you eventually do see photos of them fully cross-dressed, a lot of the times they look like 80s pinup models. And to them, that is like the proper height of feminine expression when you're trying to make yourself sexually appealing to a man. And because they have these like very black and white sort of ways of thinking about gender, when they cross-dress, it is pretty common that they will be open to men, but only when they're cross-dressed. Because to them, they sort of see that as the right way for things to go. And yeah, they might also be interested in women. They might also desire taking on the position of a woman in a sexual dynamic with another woman. But the thing that makes them stand out to me is that when these men are presenting themselves in their daily lives as your standard heterosexual man, these are usually the kind of guys that would be terrified of anyone knowing about this. A lot of shame exists amongst this particular type of crossdresser. Very, very few of these crossdressers actually end up making it a thing that exists outside of their bedroom. It is a fetish. And there really is a difference between those people and people who are somewhere on the trans spectrum, right? Because usually when someone is trans but hiding it, they have some intention to eventually live within their truth. But a lot of times these cross-dressers, it is a fetish that almost exclusively comes from their very heterosexist way of viewing men and women. For a lot of white men in Thailand, they come because they want to have a very specific experience of gender. They want to have the experience of being a rich, masculine man who can do a lot of things for a woman. And they like the idea that doing so makes these women more submissive. So these men cross-dressing, it's very unsurprising to me purely because kind of comes with the territory with a lot of these dudes who are obsessed with maintaining these sort of binary ways of thinking and doing. So yeah, for me, autogynephelia has always been a term that really does make sense for the cross-dresser. And my theory personally is that the guy who created the term was a cross-dresser, and that's why he knows so much about this. So most of these people aren't going to transition because they're not trans. And I think that there really is a difference between what we're talking about here, and someone who is designated male at birth, who predominantly has dated women, is maybe only attracted to women, who uses cross-dressing as a way to explore their gender before they actually do transition. The kind of person I'm talking about, they have quite extreme misogynistic feelings. They have quite extreme feelings of hatred towards women, and they see women in a very particular way. They don't see femininity as necessarily validating to themselves. They see femininity as like this degrading thing that they are practicing in order to fulfill a role. Like I said, not all cross-dressers are the same, but within the context of what we're talking about in this video, this was a guy who, he went to Asia, right? Because he wanted to be a hypermasculine man with what he perceived to be the height of femininity and submission. And he was able to play this role over and over and over and over and over again until he got sick of it and recognized that he actually wanted to be on the other side of it, right? That comes from a very extreme obsession with gender roles and the very binary way that we look at it. For some people, binary gender can become a fetish in many ways. This idea that only men do this and only women do that, for some people who are cross-dressers, can become something they fetishize. So these people aren't going to transition. And I don't necessarily think it's helpful to describe every person who is a cross-dresser as an autogynephile, rather. I think autogynephelia as a phrase, it's kind of messy and often misapplied. I don't think it really does refer to even most cross-dressers, but there is a very particular type of man who likes being a man, who identifies as a man, who is comfortable in his identity as a man, who gets off on this idea of retreating into a degraded feminine presentation that he uses in order to embody the kind of woman that he fantasizes about having sex with. To me, that's one of the very real ways that autogynephilia materializes, because more often than not, what these guys are trying to do is embody the very type of woman that they want to have sex with. That's really not what someone who has only dated women, who is designated male at birth, who might privately cross-dress in order to sort of explore their gender, is doing. It's not really the same thing. And just because someone cross-dresses in private doesn't mean that it's sexual, right? Some people are just in a situation where they can't wear these things outside, or they are really afraid of what wearing these things outside will mean. I've known a handful of trans women who are read as cis men in their daily lives, who take hormones privately and allow their body to change and shift before they feel confident enough to start wearing feminine clothing. That, I would say, is fairly common and not really the same thing. Yes, absolutely. And this is a thing that always really stands out for me when it comes to this particular genre of man. Because personally, I think that if you're trying to get your back blown out by a bunch of dudes, I don't know if cross-dressing is the best way to do it, right? You can find plenty of men who are attracted to men who want to do that, but that's not what this is for a lot of people. And that's kind of where this gets kind of complicated, right? Because, again, and I don't really think that autogynephilia is like necessarily like a valid premise per se, but these are men who quite frequently, they can only justify having a sexual relationship with a man when they are cross-dressed in feminine clothing that they feel is inherently degrading to them in some way, where they are specifically playing the role of a woman that they are interested in having sex with, performing the sort of sexual role, often with the mindset that they're doing it better than an actual woman would do it. With men, right? Like, it's a gender role thing. It's like it's almost like it's a fetish with gender roles. And I want to reinforce that not all cross-dressers are like this, right? There's definitely a range. There are definitely plenty of gay dudes who like to cross-dress, who, still end up having sex with those dudes. There's also some gay men who really do like, the whole feminine lingerie thing, if we're being frank, right? But these particular dudes, right, who have this kind of really tenuous, abusive relationship with women who cross-dress, it often is this thing where they don't want to have sex with men as a man. They want to perform the sexual role of the kind of women that they sexually desire. And the really interesting thing about this is so frequently their conception of this idealistic role that a woman is supposed to play in the bedroom, it's fantasy. It's frankly male gaze fantasy, right? Like I mentioned in a previous video, a lot of these dudes have a specific fetish for like an 80s pinup girl kind of vibe, right? If you've ever worn fishnets, if you've ever worn leggings, if you've ever worn half the shit that these dudes fetishize, not really the most comfortable thing to wear in the bedroom. Not really, right? Not really. But they have this like very curated particular image of like the kind of way that a woman is supposed to express herself. And they sort of expect for women to express themselves in that particular way. And a lot of them are actually frustrated by not being able to find that. It's worth noting that this guy has a habit of hiring sex workers, right? A lot of these guys do have a habit of hiring sex workers because that's one of the only scenarios where they could maybe get a woman to kind of play the role, right? And in their normal relationships, right, that are not sex work, they often find that women don't want to play that role, right? Like a lot of these dudes, they have these, they have this feeling about women where it's like, they just feel like women have become not as feminine. They just feel like women have sort of become more masculine, less caring, less glamorous, essentially. And so they want to become this kind of like glamorous version of a woman who they can have sex with. And that's part of why, a lot of cross-dressers, they will develop an entire separate persona that they will create a whole lore and image around. And the thing is, a lot of times these men, when they're cross-dressed, they are gutter, bucket, sluts, and whores. Like, I mean, there was a guy that I knew who, I knew him, I talked about this in my Josh Cedar video, I knew him as your very stereotypical, like, hyper-masculine suburban dude, right? He was a guy who, dressed a certain way, he had kind of like his hyper-masculine cargo short, extended truck kind of, or lifted truck kind of vibe. A guy that you would never look at as feminine at all. A guy that you would for sure be like, that is a dude's dude, right? And when I found his cross-dress profile, first of all, it was way more filled out than his cis male profile, right? His cis male profile was pretty simplistic, right? Said all the things that you would want to say, but his cross-dress profile was so extensive, right? He would write about how much he loves to be a slut, how much he loves to be submissive, how much he loves being passed around by men, right? And it was like he was writing from the perspective of the kind of like naughty woman that you would like to have sex with, right? So when I kind of say that there is something to autogynephilia, that's sort of what I'm talking about, where these men sort of have this thing where they're fetishizing a very particular vision of a woman, and then because they can't find it often, they will try to embody it themselves. And for a lot of men, because they have such strong, sharp gender role, gender binary feelings, it is really taboo to them. They have this other side. And the other side is something that they don't want anyone to know about. The thing about these dudes is they are quite often homophobic. They are quite often transphobic, right? I've had a lot of arguments with these dudes, where he might have, wanted me to blow his back out. Something I can't physically do, but we won't get into that in this video. But when I say, no, actually, I'm not interested in that, that's when I become a faggot. That's when I become nothing more than just a confused man, right? Even though here he is, a full cross-dresser, right? These guys are like, they're on another level. And the thing is, most people will never be privy to it, which is part of why I try to talk about it when I can, because these men will not publicly talk about it. The people who they show this side to are often like sex workers and trans women, right? People who aren't often listened to in society. And I just think that it's worth seeing that that's kind of the way that this often ends up going. I do think that if you meet a man who has very sharp feelings about gender roles, who spends a lot of time trying to tell you what you're supposed to do as a woman, what he's supposed to do as a man, who is very vocally homophobic, very vocally transphobic, who has a particular interest in lingerie, 1 + 1, you know what I mean? 2 + 2, you know what I mean? It's all kind of, yeah, that's an indication, I would say.